Okay. Again, welcome to everybody, and thank you for being here at Friday Reflections, our weekly get-together, Friday, 10 a.m. West Coast, 10 to 10:30. Just a 30-minute check-in on what's been going on this week and how it connects to the hidden parts of our lives, the soul, if you want to call it that, or the psyche, or the depths of our being, and how that connects to the world's wisdom traditions, and how that connects to the specific challenges of this time and place and this week. So I've been thinking about a lot of things this week. Of course, that's how. Let's get into some thinking about big questions that are swirling around, I bet, through all of us. And I want to think about a wonderful word, numinous, N-U-M-I N-O-U-S, N-U-M-I-N-O-U-S, numinous. It's a made up word. It's a word made up by a guy called Rudolf Otto, O-T-T-O. Rudolf Otto is, in my business, in religious studies, he's a big deal. He wrote the most important book in Germany on religious studies, on theology in the 20th century. So Rudolf Otto was born 1869, died in 1937. He wrote a lot of books, but the book I'm thinking about is called The Idea of the Holy. Now, why am I talking about his word numinous? Well, let me explain the word to you. I think it's very connected to what we almost always do here together on Friday. And it comes from the Latin word numen, N-U-M-E-N, meaning spirit. So what Otto was kind of grappling to describe was the mystical experience, the experience of the transcendent, the experience of the holy. And whether you're an atheist or an agnostic or some kind of theist or whatever your theological, dome is, whatever ideology you ascribe to, whatever your description of reality is, this is a very live idea. This idea that, according to Otto, was at the origin of religion. One of the questions Otto was trying to answer was, how did religion begin? Like, why did it even happen? This thing called religion. And he said, at the beginning of religions, and he was focusing mostly on Western religions, the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, maybe even a little bit, mostly the Judeo-Christian thing. And he was hypothesizing that religions begin in a numinous experience of a particular individual. Like when Moses in the book of Exodus, hears the voice of God and he goes around the corner and there's this burning bush that's not being consumed by the fire. This theophany, this God vision, this miraculous, crazy scene where Moses meets God. And did I say Abraham? Where Moses meets God. And Moses is the key character in the book of Exodus, of course. This is before the Ten Commandments and all that. This is the beginning of the story, really, of how Moses became this key figure. And so Rudolf Otto suggesting, see, that's how religion began. One guy on a Tuesday afternoon has a numinous experience. Now, how does Otto define numinous? He calls it, quote, non-rational, non-sensory experience or feeling whose primary and immediate object is outside of the self. So there's two pieces to that. Not only can you not rationally understand it, not only is it not something you see or feel with the five senses, but it is also an encounter with the other, with an other outside of you. It isn't just you having some trippy thoughts. So that's how Otto defines the numinous experience: non-rational, non-sensory experience or feeling whose primary and immediate object is outside of the self. Now, obviously, that's still a deeply subjective experience that you can't verify for anyone else. Everyone else on earth is perfectly what's the word I'm struggling to find? It would be reasonable for every other person on earth to simply dismiss your claims as hallucinations. And of course, that's what the materialist or atheist position would be, that, oh, you're just, you had some bad sausage for lunch. You're just having fantasies. But Otto is trying to grapple with the prophetic tradition of the Bible, and largely also with all religions. Toward the end of his career, he wrote a book called Mysticism, East and West. And this might be more of interest to those of you, and I know you're here, who aren't so keen on the Bible and that sort of traditional Judeo-Christian God concept, are more interested in, pointing to Ganesha and Shiva here, more interested in Buddhism, Hinduism, non-duality, meditation, and so on. And I've got feet in all of these camps, so I totally relate. So toward the end of his career, Otto wrote another book that I just ordered this morning called Mysticism, East and West, where Otto does a comparison between Meister Eckhart, the Dominican Catholic priest of the 14th century, who is everybody's favorite Christian mystic, who talks a lot about non-duality and oneness with God. He's a pretty heretical Christian. So it's a comparison between the mystical experience of Meister Eckhart and a Hindu philosopher called Shankara. And Shankara is most closely associated with Advaita Vedanta. the non-dualism of Hinduism. We'll talk about that more on Tuesday. The idea that all is one, that there's not some God up here that we need a relationship with, that the God word is the name of the holy presence that is immanent within all things. A panentheism, if you want to put a technical theological label on it. So Otto is very deeply interested in investigating questions that you and I often take up here. You know, what does holiness mean? What does God mean? What does my own shifting experience of all of that mean? How does this all kind of fit together between our prayer life, our meditation life, our philosophical doubts about various God concepts, you know, all of us that are wrestling with all of this stuff, and yet still all that rational disputation and debate aside, once in a while, we still feel like we have that numinous experience. It's not just Moses and Muhammad that get to have numinous experiences. It's something that is available to every human being. I've talked about some experiences that I've had that seem to fit that. I had lunch yesterday with a beautiful colleague and friend of mine, Alejandro Orozco, one of my philosophical colleagues at Southwestern College, a philosophy professor who just retired a couple of weeks ago. So we got together for tacos in Mission Valley, and we were talking about all this stuff, and he shared with me this amazing experience he had when he was 19, backpacking through Europe in a crummy hotel in Spain. And I won't get into all of that here because it's not my story to tell, but it was, you know, he ended up becoming a Dominican friar after that for about 11 years. And then he left the order and got married and became a philosophy professor. So that was just a remarkable example, again, of somebody having this numinous experience. Now, the reason why I'm thinking so much this week about the numinous experience, this trans-rational, non-sensory encounter with something that just stops you in your tracks, makes the hair on your arm stand up, and you're convinced that you are meeting, for lack of a better word, God. And look, I'm right there with you. The God word for me has a lot of baggage, and I wasn't even wounded by religion. You know, I didn't, as I've shared with y'all many times, I didn't grow up in a particular faith tradition. So I come to this kind of from a neutral stance, but I meet people all the time who are angry, bitter, resentful, rage-filled toward religion, specifically mostly Christianity, and maybe most specifically the Roman Catholic tradition. And so if you even mention God, people get really worked up and mad, and it's like you're picking at a wound that they have. Bishop John Shelby Spong calls them Christians in exile. You know, people who maybe come from the church but have left for, in their mind, a lot of very good reasons, the abuses and so on and so on and so on, and maybe gone all the way over to a materialistic, atheistic stance. So one of the ways I always navigate that is by thinking of two other very prominent 19th, 20th century figures. Of course, I'm talking about Sigmund Freud and a guy about 19 years younger than him, Carl Jung. So Freud and Jung, and all my psychology people are nodding out there. Yeah, you know who we're talking about here. Towering figures of significance, not only in psychology, but really in all other academic fields as well. So Freud was born 1856 to 1939, and Jung born about 19 years later, 1875 to 1961. And Freud, just very, very briefly here, Freud, of course, was an atheist and a materialist. And he came out of the medical background, as did Carl Jung. And as a medical scientist, you know, his field was biology and medical research. And he didn't have patience for the idea of God. He thought that well, like atheism holds, right? There's no God, there's no soul, there's no afterlife. And so it aligns with another philosophical ideology called materialism, that there is only matter, that the entire universe is, the only thing that's real is material, matter. Even consciousness in the materialist view is a byproduct of our material existence. You know, consciousness, this thing that you and I are doing right here, self-awareness, higher order thinking, language, analogy, metaphor, consciousness is, in the materialist view, a very sophisticated evolutionary development of material systems. So when the material structure is damaged, you know, when the body dies, there's no soul, there's no consciousness that goes on. That's the Freudian view. And many people, of course, hold that view. Now, his younger colleague, Carl Jung, they used to be as thick as thieves and very, very tight, right? Because a lot of their work is very, very interconnected. But Jung parted ways mid-career. Why? Because Jung began to study Hinduism and world mythology and religion in general and spiritual experiences. And he began, in his view, to realize that there was something here that Freud was missing, that there is more to reality than just matter. And Jung, of course, noticed as he studied world mythology and world religion that there were certain key ideas that kept recurring. And we've talked about these before if you've been with me before. He called them archetypes. So an archetype is a universal idea that pops up all over the world in different religions and mythologies in cultures that had no contact with each other. So you can't claim that the idea transferred from this culture on some trade route to this culture, because we're talking about cultures that never had any contact with each other. And so archetypes, I'll give you an example, the supreme being archetype, the idea that there is an invisible reality hidden from us by the visible, or the hero's journey archetype. There's a whole narrative structure that pops up in different places, or specific symbols, the symbol of the circle, the symbol of the sacred mountain, and so on, and so on, and so on. There are a number of these archetypes, universal ideas that pop up, that well up in all human cultures. Now, where do they come from? Jung hypothesizes, again, I don't even want to call this a theory. This is just a hypothesis. You know the difference, right? A hypothesis is an educated guess. A theory is a well-established hypothesis that has been peer-reviewed and supported by evidence for generations, like the theory of evolution, right? That's not just a hypothesis. So whenever anybody uses the phrase just a theory, you know they don't know what a theory is. Okay. Jung hypothesized that, maybe these archetypes are welling up from something called the collective unconscious. So he's borrowing Freud's term of the unconscious, and we'll do a show on that because that's amazing. Someday we'll do that. That most of my consciousness as an individual is hidden from my own awareness, and yet it's driving much of my surface consciousness and my behavior. Hence the need for psychotherapy, etc. The Jungian shift is to take that Freudian idea of the unconscious and make it collective. So Jung is wondering, can I put it that way? Jung is wondering, is there some sense in which all human beings are connected primally to this? You know what? I'll use a modern analogy, the cloud. Oh, I see a question there. What's the name of the church? It's called Vision, a Center for Spiritual Living, right? It's in San Diego, but it doesn't matter where you are because you'll be attending virtually. Vision, a Center for Spiritual Living. Thank you for that. So the collective unconscious, you know, it's like the cloud. You know how when I take pictures on my phone, they fly automatically up into the cloud. They're not in any of my computers. They exist up there. So imagine a cloud that we're all tapped into, a single cloud account that we're all kind of connected to. And some people are really good at downloading from the cloud. Other people don't even know the cloud is there. So that's the collective unconscious. And so Jung is arguing that artists, this is where it gets good for me, artists in every generation, their job is to render in expressive forms, paintings, photographs, films, novels, poems, dances, etc., architecture. Their job, operas, their job is to articulate in whatever their medium is, relevant expressions of those archetypes that well up from the collective unconscious. Artists are channelers of the collective unconscious that help all of us connect to these deep and instructive and nourishing truths. So for Jung, religion and mythology is not only important, it's the most important thing. Freud hated this. Freud divorced him, so to speak. He just, they had a bad breakup over this. And as you can tell from my interests and how I talk every time I see you, I'm on Jung's side, right? I'm no traditional theist, but I appreciate Jung's leaving the door open to the numinous experience. So let me share with you a passage that Jung wrote in one of his letters, because the correspondence between Jung and Freud is one of the great reads of the 20th century as they argue about this stuff. So here's Jung explaining the central thrust of his work. He says, the main interest, this is Carl Jung from one of his letters, the main interest of my work is not concerned with the treatment of neurosis, but rather with the approach to the numinous. So he's contrasting his work from Jung. Jung is doing psychoanalysis. His core focus is to treat neurosis. And Jung is saying, Jung doesn't even claim to be a psychoanalyst. He's doing analytic psychology. I'll leave that hair splitting for another day. But Jung is saying, I'm not that interested in treating neurosis, but watch how he works his way back around to it. He says, the main interest of my work is not concerned with the treatment of neuroses, but rather with the approach to the numinous. But the fact that the approach to the numinous is the real therapy. And inasmuch as you attain to the numinous experience, you are released from the curse of pathology. Even the very disease takes on a numinous character. Are you with me here? Look what Jung just did. He said, I'm not here just to treat neurosis. I want to lead people to the numinous. And let me paraphrase now. And when they experience the numinous, their neurosis shifts. It shrinks. It's no longer an overriding, debilitating pathology. It's just another experiential moment in their experiential realm. And I love that last piece. Even the very disease takes on a numinous character. So like any healer, Jung wants to transmute suffering, like an alchemist transmuting lead into gold. Jung wants to transmute our brokenness, right? My phobias, my neurosis, my anxieties, my depressions. Jung wants to treat those not just with having me lay on a couch and talk about my mother, but Jung wants to drag us into the mythic religious realm so that, or take us backpacking, or take mushrooms, or whatever it is, that get people to this place where the old view starts to crumble and they experience the numinous. And again, in Otto's language, the numinous is non-rational, non-sensory experience or feeling, whose primary and immediate object is outside the self, to get me out of my own head, so that I'm not just stewing in my repetitive, pathological, neurotic thoughts, but that I am looking into the Grand Canyon and realizing something powerful and profound. My dog killed a rabbit the other day in my backyard. He's a terrier. It's in his breeding. to chase little rodents and not, I don't think intentionally murder them, but just stop them. And when he put his paw on this rabbit's back, it broke his back and he slipped under the fence, and I watched him crawl away, dragging his back legs. I'm sorry if this is painful for you to hear. Trust me, it wasn't nearly as painful as hearing it and seeing it and being with that rabbit. It took about 5 minutes for him to die, and then taking him out into the field. It was miserable. I had trouble sleeping that night. I don't like that. And it was a beautiful juvenile creature, perfect fur, perfect ears, perfect eyes. And yet, even in that horror, there was something holy. There was something nameless. There was something riveting, sorrowful, beyond rationality. I couldn't hate my dog. I couldn't even be mad at him. I love my dog. He's amazing. I try to keep him away from stuff like that, but one got in the yard, you know. So I feel that there is wonder and mystery and beauty in the birth and in the death and in all of it. And the numinous is ever present. I use this phrase a lot. We don't have a proximity problem. We have a perception problem. It's not that the numinous is very distant from us and it only touches down once in a while. I suspect and I suggest that it's actually ever present. But you and I are just too busy. I'm just too busy being Peter Bolland, which, trust me, is a full-time job. All the things I have to work myself up about. So you know I'm going to close with a poem, as I always do, to, I hope, bring a little bit closer to the surface this shimmering notion of the numinous experience. And you notice how I'm avoiding the whole, is there a God or is there not a God? This is so far past that. This is so far past the sort of false dichotomy between theism and atheism. We're talking about something so much richer now. So I want to leave you with a poem by my friend, Fred Lamont. I don't mean literally my friend. I never met him, but I think of him as my friend. He teaches this same kind of stuff that I teach. He's up in the Pacific Northwest. Look up his poetry sometime online. Fred Lamott, Lamotte. Fred Lamont. This is a poem that's not titled. I found it on a Facebook group called Echoes of Panhala. If you're on Facebook, look up Echoes from Panhala, Panhala. It's a beautiful Facebook site and group. All they do is just post beautiful spiritual numinous poetry. I get a lot of my poems from them, and I don't mention them often enough. I want to credit their anthology work, going out and finding these things and putting them on a Facebook page called Echoes of Panhala. So here's a poem from Fred Lamott. When you discover that each breath is nectar indescribably sweet, and the space between your heartbeats is the silence between the stars, and the one who encircles you with unfathomable compassion is inside, and the luminous hollow of each nerve in your body echoes with the sound that created all things, then you are rich. You need nothing. You can begin to live in the moonlight, the sensation of dew on bare feet, the smell of honeysuckle, the sparkling transparency of this perishing moment. Fred Lamott. Thanks for joining me again for another installment of Friday Reflections. Have a blessed week. And maybe I'll see some of you on Sunday morning at Vision, the Center for Spiritual Living. Just Google that. Or I'll see you here on Tuesday for the Wisdom of Hinduism. Or for sure, I'll see you next Friday for the next installment of Friday Reflections. Thanks, everybody. See ya.